It's not often in life when you get the opportunity to correct a mistake, make up for an oversight, get a second chance. But what we're going to see here is after World War II, the United States took advantage of just such an opportunity uh, and really changed the course of world history. So we're going to talk about the United Nations in this video. What happens is once the Allies feel like they've secured um, a foothold, once it looks like the end of the war is going to go the way that they want it to go, they began talking about what the world was going to look like after World War II. How are they going to start to piece the world back together? And most importantly, how do they make sure that they're not piecing together something that in another 20 years is going to lead to another world war? And so they meet at a place called Yalta. And Yalta was on the Mediterranean. And this is kind of the last meeting between the big three. This is the last one that Roosevelt will be able to attend. Stalin and Churchill are there. And so they have some issues to talk about. What are we going to do about Poland, right? Because remember, Germany's got a claim to part of it, but the Soviet Union's rolled into part of it as well. What's that going to look like? What are they going to do with Germany after the war? How are they going to divide it up, but rebuild that country in a way to where they're no longer a threat to do this in Europe? And one of the things that they decide to do is to um, really put some power behind this idea of a place where nations can come together to talk about their problems. Now we had that after World War One. It was the idea of our own president, Woodrow Wilson. It was called the League of Nations. But if you remember, the United States Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and so the United States never joined the League of Nations, which left it wanting for power and influence. So the first idea is, hey, do we just join that and try to work within those, or what they ultimately decide on is, do we do something different? Do we um, do we make a new organization where this will happen? And that's what they decide to do, and they make the United Nations. There are 193 member nations of the United Nations. Most nations in the world are members of the United Nations. You've really got to be a punk if they won't let you in here. 1945, so after the war or right at the end of the war in Europe, in San Francisco, these countries will get together to sign the UN Charter. It's going to replace the League of Nations. Now, the headquarters is going to be in New York City. The United States gives the land for this beautiful headquarters that you see here to be built. It's a cool building. If you ever get a chance to go to New York City, you can tour the United Nations, and there are all kinds of gifts and things that different nations have given. One of the things that I remember seeing, Japan actually gave a statue and a group of kind of melted together coins that survived the bombing of Hiroshima. And so just some kind of neat stuff in there that you can see. Conveniently, this was right down the road from Franklin Roosevelt's home in Hyde Park, New York. And before he'd gotten sick, kind of his original plan had been that he would go down and work at the United Nations after he was done being president. So already lining up that next gig. Of course, it doesn't happen. He doesn't survive the end of the war. Eventually, though, his wife Eleanor will be an ambassador to the United Nations. So there's a Roosevelt that'll have a part to play there. There are a couple of different parts of the United Nations. The first is called the General Assembly. And the General Assembly is this huge room where every nation comes in. They have representatives that sit there, and everybody gets a vote. So everybody's equal in the General Assembly. There's a Secretary General. This is the Secretary General now, Antonio um, Gutierrez, I believe is his name. He's from Portugal. He has been there since 2017. And so they get 5 year terms, and usually you get 2 5 year terms. I think there's only been one uh, Secretary General of the United Nations that um, didn't get 2 terms. It was back when I was a kid, and I don't remember why we didn't like this guy, but we basically said we're going to get somebody else, and made sure he was voted out. But his name was Boutros Ghali, which is just kind of a fun name. But he must not have been a nice person, or we didn't like him because we didn't want him in there. Neither here nor there. But everybody gets a vote. If you look here, you can see um, kind of the overlooking galleries of this, those black lines that are there. Every person, obviously, in there could possibly speak a different language, right? These are from countries all over the world. And so the official languages of the United Nations are French and English, but you can get what's being said on the floor translated into whatever language you want. There's just an earpiece you put in. There are people up there. Nicole Kidman, several years ago, was in a movie called The Interpreter, where she is UN interpreter, and she sees somebody killed on the floor of the UN. It wasn't a bad movie. If you want to see what the inside of the building looks like, I've got a copy in the film library, but I'm sure you could find it somewhere to stream as well. Every September, the President of the United States goes at the opening of the new session of the UN and gives a speech, and so that's usually the time that you'll hear about it happening. The most important part of the United Nations, at least for the history of the United States, is the Security Council. The Security Council is made up of 15 nations, 5 of them that are permanent representatives on the Security Council, and then the other 10 rotate through the different countries. And you'll see in a second why the countries are permanent that are permanent. But if there's an immediate threat, right, if there's something going on in the world that needs to be addressed by the world community, it comes to the Security Council. So during the Cuban Missile Crisis that we'll see in the 1960s, that went to the Security Council. Anytime there's possible genocide going on, or a war, these folks get together because obviously with 15 people you can decide things much more quickly. The UN doesn't have troops itself, but it borrows troops from member nations. One of the interesting things they've started to do lately is they try to borrow troops from member nations who have the same cultural makeup and background as the country they're going to be going to. So if you were going to primarily Muslim country, you would want to borrow troops from other Muslim countries because they understand obviously the culture, traditions, the expectations of what would be going on there. Usually, if you see UN troops, and some of you had said you'd seen Hotel Rwanda, there's some UN troops that are in there. Usually, they have like the light blue berets that they'll wear that make them stand out as UN security forces that are there. But there are some really cool battles that happen in between. I'll put one up dealing with the Security Council at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets and the United States have some famous theatrics that go on in this room. The permanent members of the Security Council are the United States, the Russian Federation, Great Britain, France, and China. So every one of these countries is always on the Security Council. They also have what is called veto power. So if one of these countries votes against a Security Council resolution, the resolution is dead. Now that's an amazing amount of power to have. But these are some of the biggest, most influential countries in the world. They're also the victors in World War II. And so you can see that they reserve that power for themselves afterwards. Now, the problem is, during something like the Cold War, when you've got the Soviets and the United States disagreeing about things, obviously either one of them could veto something that the other one liked. And so it kind of bogs things down a little bit. There's been talk about giving up permanent membership or doing away with it, but really, if you had it, why would you give it up? So I don't know that that's going to happen anytime soon. There are other things that are there. Like I said, the General Assembly is there, the Security Council. The International Court of Justice is affiliated with with the United Nations, and so that's where if somebody does crimes against humanity or things like that. There's an economic arm that tries to help countries out that are struggling financially. So there's just all kinds of different parts of the United Nations that are going to be working in different ways. Really, the goal of the United Nations is to give countries a place to settle their conflicts peacefully. So, after World War II, what's their job? Prevent World War III. Well, there hasn't been a World War III yet, so they've done a good job with that. Now there are obviously um, different views, and no organization like this is perfect, but I think you could argue that probably more good has been done than bad from the United Nations, if for nothing else than just uh, giving people a chance to work on these things peacefully, having a place where the world can come together to put joint pressure on somebody in order to uh, you know make things uh, make things a little better.